Welcome to the Texas Children in Nature Network webinar, Texan by Nature. Data is a driver, a common language, and a decision maker. My name is Sarah Coles, and I am the Executive Director of the Texas Children in Nature Network. We are excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session, so thank you for joining us. To save bandwidth for all of our attendees and for a clean recording, we ask that everyone turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation. I'll be monitoring the chat to share, so you can share your questions there, and I'll share them with our presenters. Please remember to keep your comments in the chat kind. Courtney Krim is running tech for us today. Thank you, Courtney. Alice will be sharing the recording in a follow-up email. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change it to anonymous and then message Courtney with your name. If you're in need of a certificate, you will need to have your name match what you registered with. And just a reminder, if you're needing a certificate, you'll need to email the address provided in the Zoom link email. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sauna people. Our ongoing colonial presence on indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. I'm going to put a few links in the chat about land acknowledgements. And now I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speaker tonight. Caitlin Tran is with Texan by Nature, and she has a really great presentation today about one of their big projects. So I'm going to go ahead and send it over to you, Caitlin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Texas Children in Nature Network, for having me and hosting this webinar. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Caitlin Tran, and I'm a program manager at Texan by Nature. I'm looking forward to sharing more about what we do at Texan by Nature and the importance of data and conservation, specifically how we can utilize data as a driver, a common language, and a decision maker. So a little bit about Texan by Nature. We are a conservation nonprofit that exists to advance conservation that is beneficial to people, prosperity, and natural resources. Our three pillars are to connect, convene, and catalyze, and we partner deeply with conservation organizations and business to act as an accelerator for conservation partners and a strategic partner for business. In 2011, Texan by Nature's founders saw great conservation work taking place across the state, but a little bit of a lack of partnerships and data-based approaches. And in a large state like Texas, where more than 94% of land is privately owned, we believe that teamwork and targeted strategies are critical to conservation success. And so Texan by Nature has a vision to align the broad interests of conservation groups with the resources of businesses to benefit communities and contribute to all of these stakeholder values, and position ourselves between the three so that we can support, again, the advancement of conservation. At Texan by Nature, we see Texas as a model for the world and believe that we will have the greatest chance of sustaining and growing human health and economic prosperity when the land is managed to provide both economic output and maintenance of our natural systems and ecosystem services. So how do we start to utilize Texas conservation as a model for the world? Starts with us people. Texans are proud, and we have a lot to be proud of. Texas has the 8th largest economy, home to 11 diverse ecoregions, and is a world leader in energy production and exports. We also have over 200 conservation organizations serving a rapidly growing population. So a lot of you on today's webinar are connecting children and families to nature so that they are not only happier and healthier, but so that they care about nature. And as you all likely know, that when you care about something, you're more likely to be proud of it and to take care of it. And so again, Texans are proud. So why aren't we known for taking care of what makes us proud? Why aren't we investing more in conservation? And why aren't more sharing the results of that conservation. So while we may understand as a conservation community a single metric such as acres of land or gallons of water, we don't often have data that captures the full ecosystem impact of or economic value of the conservation work performed. And this often leads to an incomplete business case analysis, fewer partnerships, and less funding than is available in a state that is known and filled with global leadership in industry, conservation, and academia. And so Texan by Nature works toward our goal of advancing conservation by filling these gaps and creating and sharing frameworks for data, reporting, and collaboration. To realize the full potential of funding, activity, and partnerships for conservation, Texan by Nature works not only to bring industry and conservation together, but to highlight and provide that sound data to make the case for conservation. And so now I'll get kind of into the main topic of the webinar and the importance of data in the conservation community. To start, data is a driver. It begins with us as conservation organizations and contributors into conservation, collecting, sharing, and better articulating our own impact to drive understanding and investment in conservation. So really, what will it take for us to accelerate conservation that has sustainable change? We tried to understand this, and over the past 5 years, Texan by Nature has held roundtables, hosted partner meetings, and summits and convening events to ask these questions. And we found some common gaps amongst all areas, both conservation and industry, and engaging with various partners witnessed some of these gaps in action. And so from our perspective, there are some barriers towards sustainable change that include the lack of common language, inconsistent data, the lack of a standard for reporting, and collaborative ecosystem level thinking. And so our goal in sharing the return on conservation framework was to try to answer these questions. One, how do we evaluate projects, achieve the greatest impact, measure success, and again, report in a way that's most beneficial and widely understood. And so the return on conservation framework was created to understand just that. Our goal was to deliver standardized data for use in dialogue, evaluation, reporting. So we vetted a variety of sources and aggregated data and impact metrics to create the return on conservation framework, which we define as presenting a total view realized by investing in conservation, encompassing all variables, be that financial, human, and natural resource impact. The total value of conservation work is not just a single metric such as number of acres or gallons of water, but can go further into the economic impact of conservation work realized in terms of cleaner air, healthier habitat, more abundant water, stable supply chains, healthier people, and many more. And so we as the conservation community know that conservation is good. It's good for our natural resources, it's good for our economy, and it can be good for our health, but how good is it, and what is the actual return on the money that we invest into conservation for the state of Texas? And so, again, we compiled publicly available financial data for non-governmental organizations or NGOs from the IRS Form 990, the tax filing document, and worked with state partners and national NGOs to understand the investment and money going into Texas conservation. And by capturing that information, we understood the how much, but we wanted to know was the return. And so we analyzed it with literature for a full system of benefits, similar to the ones that I was mentioning before, for ecosystem services like biodiversity, carbon sequestration, water quantity and quality improvement, increase in ecotourism, job creation, storm mitigation, really a large matrix of ecosystem services to calculate a return for that conservation investment. And so in 2023, Texan by Nature released the first return on conservation report and identified $639 million in conservation investment in the year 2019 by NGOs and state agencies. And again, by aligning those expenses with the organization's self-reported impact data and multiplying them by ecosystem service studies, we calculated a $2.8 billion return on conservation value, again in fiscal year 2019. So this represents $4.39 returned for every $1 spent on conservation. And that $1 spend includes all of the expenses, not just the programmatic cost, so administrative, operational, fundraising, and we view that as a great and affirming number that conservation is good for the business, for the business bottom line. And so again, confirm that outside of just the moral choice that it's a good decision and it supports our communities, it's also good economically. And so these are just the high level numbers that are featured in the report. And it has further breakdowns of the spend and return analysis by ecoregion and activity, including on-the-ground conservation, access, outreach, and education, and then also research and policy. One that may be specifically relevant for this audience is the investment into access, outreach, and education. So there's a section of the report highlighting that you all can read more at texanbynature.org/ROC report. All of the proxies are available for use and demonstrated again within the report. And it's our hope that you guys will be able to utilize the data in the report to make the case for conservation and drive more activity and funding for the important efforts that are already doing. So we hope that if you have a chance to read through the report, you reach out with any questions, provide feedback or suggestions on additional data sources that you may know of to include in the report, so that as we iterate on it, we can continue to make it more robust and expand the case and funding for conservation in the future. And so if we are able to utilize the return on conservation framework to align as a conservation community on how to capture and present data, how do we also ensure that that carries over into reporting for other groups like funders and business to understand and use data to speak a common language? So in our work with industry and conservation partners, we often saw that funding to conservation projects was often held up due to a lack of a common language or metrics that a conservation organization would present versus what an industry partner would need to make a decision. And so in 2021, we started to look at what type of frameworks were widely available and used by our industry partners, and noticed that more and more folks were aligning and companies were aligning to a standardized goal framework that was followed not just by a single stakeholder, but standard goals that have been decided on as priorities for the entire world to work towards. And those were the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so this graphic shows the 17 goals in summary, and they're all broken down on the United Nations webpage further for sub-goals and additional targets. And a little bit just of context about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this plan was outlined 10 years ago and adopted by United Nations member states to create this 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And so the antithesis and the baseline for these goals was a call to action by all countries in a global partnership that recognized that all of these priorities are interconnected. Poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education are all interacting with one another and require a multifaceted solution. And so the UN SDGs outline global challenges that any company, government agency, etc., can contribute to by incorporating them into their strategies, mapping their impact to them, and focusing either philanthropy or operations towards achieving these goals. And so our work at the intersection of business and conservation made it clear that the metrics and reporting gap could be bridged by helping our conservation partners translate their impact into a format that industry was familiar with. And so we really utilized this as a framework and a marching point to translate and support our conservation partners to reach. And so we were able to develop the Texan by Nature Return on Conservation Index, again, looking to create that common language between conservation and businesses. So we provide this as a service to our conservation wrangler projects and business members. And in order to start to bridge that language gap, we first knew we had to work with our partners to quantify and articulate how their local conservation projects impact the environment. And so we utilized peer-reviewed literature, pulled in project-specific details, and had local stakeholder engagement to use those as inputs to understand all of the benefits that each project delivers. And then with that understanding, how did we take that to another level and focus on not just the number of people reached or acres restored, but what does that mean for gallons of water recharged into a reservoir, etc. So we looked to understand those specific outcomes and then collaborated with our partners at Ecometrics, who are ecosystem valuation experts, to get to an economic value. And they have a database of peer-reviewed and accepted economic values that define and can calculate monetary benefits for supporting people, prosperity, and natural resources. And so with those two impact values understood, we knew that using verified data and reporting standards would allow us to better communicate those conservation outcomes to industry. And so the Return on Conservation Index was born to showcase a specific project's alignment with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, their impact, associated economic value, which we wanted to present in a simple table format so that even if you weren't super familiar with the Return on Conservation Index, if you had an understanding and awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals, you could see clearly how a project would be in alignment with them. And so I pulled out one example, the Texas longleaf team, which is focusing on longleaf pine restoration in East Texas. They had a number of goals that we worked through with them, but I've pulled out 3 to highlight in today's programming, and wanted to specifically focus on Goal 6, clean water and sanitation, and kind of share how we got to this point. So previously, the Texas longleaf team knew that their actions were beneficial to water resources with their forest management practices that they were implementing, but they didn't know by how much. And so we worked with university researchers and peer-reviewed models for calculating volumetric water benefit to estimate the acre feet of water captured for an acreage of longleaf pine restoration. And so we were able to model about 50,000 acre feet of water captured or filtered for 43,000 acres of longleaf pine restoration. And that was great and getting closer to a metric that they were looking to have and one that they didn't have previously. But the question was still, what does that mean economically, and how do we see a true return on that? And so our partners, again, at Ecometrics, were able to calculate an equivalent economic value for water treatment as an offset to municipalities, and then also as the water is filtered and the water quality is increased, the decrease in nutrient load and the potential market value for that. So that's a little, again, just a little bit of a summary and background of one component and one row of these ROC indexes, or return on conservation indexes. And so again, we continued to go through each of the goals and see what impacts the longleaf team could align with, including some of the ones that I've highlighted here, their educational efforts, carbon sequestration, what exactly their impact was, and then how that results in an economic benefit. So with a more thorough understanding of longleaf pine restoration, environmental, social, and economic impacts, our partner now had a tool to communicate with funders the outcomes and benefits of the restoration work that they were proposing. And they've seen a pretty big change in some of their funding conversations. So through the Texas Water Action Collaborative, Texan by Nature was able to facilitate nearly $2 million in funding to the Texas Longleaf team for the restoration of over 3,500 acres. And we just planted about 300,000 trees over the past year. And so Texan by Nature is again filling that gap and role within the Texas Water Action Collaborative to align goals, metrics, project funding, timelines between conservation organizations that have available projects and corporate entities that are looking to fund projects, all working together to accelerate investment. And we continue to work with the Texas Longleaf team in outlining a budget and a proposal that encompassed the on-the-ground cost for restoration, as well as the personnel and the need to verify the estimated volumetric water benefit. And so we were able to activate local partners to collaborate with researchers to monitor and verify the water benefits that we had projected and modeled, and to ensure that it was actually beneficial and tracking towards that. So those understandings and those learnings will be supportive of longleaf pine restoration, not only in East Texas forestry, but the historic range across the southern United States, and really confirms to us and illustrates the opportunity to advance conservation and understanding by taking that first step of data articulation and opening the door for more conversations with funders and reporting that can, again, fund verification of benefits. So lots of information today, and really focused on data and communicating the data. So I hope that you all are able to take away today is the need for collaboration and alignment in our community to use data as a decision maker. The Return on Conservation Report has data that anyone can utilize to make the business case for conservation and drive more activity and funding for these important efforts. And then the Texan by Nature Return on Conservation Indexes, again, are created to spur the conversation and accelerate funding mechanisms, and answer the question of what is the impact. And so we work in conservation or work with folks in the conservation space. These resources can be utilized to, one, identify existing data sets and reporting standards, visualize standard methods to communicate the detailed and intricate benefits of local conservation, and then hopefully serve as an example of the data that potential stakeholders or funders may be interested in knowing about your project, so that you can model or think through what data to present when thinking through funding proposals. And overall, when we uphold a standard for internal data collection and external reporting, we can realize an increased collaboration with decision makers to advance conservation in Texas and across the world. So following today's webinar, I hope you all have some of those tools that make you feel confident in sharing that conservation is good economically, and it makes sense for industry to align their operational investments towards data drives confidence and funding, and then also that conservation project should include the true expense that it takes to achieve outcomes, including their administrative and management expenses, and also factoring in costs for data collection, baseline understanding, and then verification. So all of this to say that collaboration and sharing of information is largely needed, and we'd love to continue to build on best practices and the best available data to continue to speed up these decision-making processes and increase partnerships and funding. And then lastly are a few resources and opportunities that I've shared today. If you are part of a conservation nonprofit, we welcome you to join our partner network. You can read all about the Return on Conservation Report and see some of the resources on our website. We are also taking data submissions for 2023 financial and impact data if you'd like to be included in our next report. And then additionally, within the Return on Conservation Report is a tool called the Case Maker. And so that has all of our economic proxies that you can plug in a certain acreage for a project and get an estimated economic value based off of our analysis. And so again, we're iterating on this report, and we'll look to continue to share what we're learning and seeing about investments and return trends over time. And so if you all have any research opportunities or data available that you, as you read the report, notice are missing, please let us know, and we'll be happy to have a conversation. And then there's a link here to the Return on Conservation Indexes as well. I highlighted one of them, the Texas Longleaf Team, but there are a number of other projects that are focused on other types of projects like education, water quantity, some of our business projects as well. So that may be of interest to you all, but I see a few questions popping up in the chat here that I can start to answer.
Yeah, our first question is from Nick. They ask, I'm in California. Do you know of anything like the ROC index exists there in California? Would the index you created be applicable there?
Yeah, we have not seen anything similar to the Return on Conservation Index. Our partners, Ecometrics, do like one-off studies and a thorough economic analysis in like with partners in California, but I haven't seen anything that aligns them to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so the Return on Conservation Index is very specific to one project, and it's impacted by like the locales for the economic output. And so it may be interesting to see, but it wouldn't necessarily be transferable to or applicable to California. But the Return on Conservation Report utilizes a national framework of ecosystem services, and so those are likely more applicable if you're interested in that. And I can send some links in the chat as well.
Yeah, and Nick, I'm also adding there's the Children in Nature Network National created an ROI on green schoolyards. It's Colorado, but it's pretty applicable nationwide. And so I'm putting that in the chat as well. And then we have another question from Linda. Have you ever gathered data in an educational setting?
Yeah, education is a component of the return on conservation report that is a challenging one to quantify. We were able to capture the investment data, so um, conservation nonprofits and state agencies of what spend they were putting into education events or educational programming, but quite hard to understand the economic benefit. And there's continuing conversations for our next iteration of the report on how to truly quantify it. So in our return on conservation report, there is not a return value for education currently, but we're again looking to beef up that section in our next iteration. And the investment into education was still included in our overall return calculation for dollar invested and dollar returned. So to answer your question, Linda, it's a ever evolving thing, and I think something you all likely know more intimately than us, that as you all are being the people that are enacting the education programming, that it's quite hard to take it to that next level of what is the true economic output. But if y'all have information or data or resources that y'all are seeing great things, like, please feel free to let us know.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. What are kind of the next steps for the return on conservation data set moving forward?
Yeah, so we're beginning the next iteration of the report and are currently collecting data. So that would be investment data from conservation nonprofits, large NGOs, national NGOs for their Texas-specific data, and then working with our state agency partners to understand what is going into what they're investing into conservation. So that's our immediate first step, and then after that we'll be continuing to gather return proxies and research there, and then run the calculation and analysis to see and share if there are any trends or changes since our previous report, and share out in 2026.
Great. We have a question from Michael. In my work, I spend a lot of time talking about data and the problems collecting, cleaning, and governing and reporting on it. I'm curious what the biggest challenges and limitations you face are, and how can organizations like the Master Naturalist help with data collection or similar challenges?
Yeah, majority of the time of us really putting together this report was trying to figure out all the data to capture and standardize, and to your point, cleaning and collecting it. So that's why we utilize the IRS Form 990 as standard section where all of the inputs have to be the same for the economic or the dollar side for an organization. And then there's a section on that form that allows conservation organizations and NGOs in general to detail their programs. And so we utilize those program descriptors to understand the impact of, if they're spending, $1,000 on land restoration and it impacted 10 acres, how we could draw those lines and connect that across was the big part of our analysis. And so the biggest challenge is and limitation to that would be how well each of the organizations are able to report and articulate their impact in alignment with the funding that goes towards a certain program. And so I think in terms of Master Naturalists to help collect data, we did work with some volunteers to begin some of our initial data research. But I think it's more as a conservation community overall trying to understand what type of data points are key and helpful, and how do we start to all capture and communicate that broadly.
Great. While we're waiting for any more questions to come in, I just want to remind everyone to take a moment to fill out our evaluation. That helps us share with Caitlin how the presentation went, and also we're all environmental educators at heart, so we understand the need for evaluation. And then just a reminder, Texas Children in Nature exists because of donations. So we're able to provide this webinar because of the donations. So if you could please donate to help us out, that would be fantastic. Our next webinar is Exploring Nature's Classroom, Sensory Science for Diverse Learners. I'll put that link there. Any other questions? Have I delayed enough for you to think of one? Oh, have another one from Michael. Have you looked at using data sets like those on GBIF, for example, to see if restoring certain area leads to an increase in observation of a certain species?
I'm not familiar with the data set GBIF, or if that stands for something as well. But to see if restoring a certain area leads to increased observation of certain species. Yeah, the report is primarily the return values that we were able to calculate is for on-the-ground conservation and protection and restoration efforts. And so it hasn't gotten to the point where it's super granular for a species outcome and the return specific to one species. So I don't know if maybe I can look this up after the meeting about the GBIF and
Yeah.
see if there's
Caitlin, I wonder if like Ducks Unlimited might have some of that data since they're specifically trying to increase duck habitat.
Yeah, and we worked with Ducks Unlimited to get a perspective on how much they were investing in Texas specifically. That's another challenge that we often face because there are large national NGOs that are doing work across the country and even internationally at times. And so their Form 990s are capturing their total spend across all the areas. And so we have a specific Texas lens and wanted to understand Texas specifically. So they were able to share some of their data, and there's some examples on the report on how they're able to quantify and take some of those steps towards understanding the return, and has some more like specific examples. But
We've got totally makes sense. It's a really tough data problem. I'd love to talk more about it offline. GBIF is basically a big log of every animal observations by time, location, but I'm sure other data sets exist. The problem, like you mentioned, is standardizing and correlating the messy data.
yeah, a lot of our partners are capturing great information like that, and an abundance of data is out there, but really how do we boil it down to what is going to help us advance conservation by messaging it to the right funding partners or understanding it as a community of where we need to focus or anything like that. But any other questions?
Not seeing any other questions, but thank you so much, Caitlin, for presenting. And we'll, if you could drop those links like you did at the 2 o'clock with that are on the last slide, we can get those out to folks. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, y'all.